You stand beneath the bell, and its weight presses down heavier than seems possible. The metal is warm, almost alive, your chest tightening with the taste of iron, old fat, and something unmistakably human. A bell ringer climbed the tower, pulled the rope, and by morning, his body was found compressed, as if the bronze had swallowed him. The bell did not ring, it remembered. It watched. And now, every sound, every strike, is not music, it is memory of a pain you cannot accept. The first scream was not heard by any living ear, because it never belonged to the air. It traveled through bronze while the metal was still soft with heat, trapped inside a body thicker than a man's chest, pressed there by gravity and fire and intention. When the new bell was raised into the tower of the Cathedral of Seville, ropes creaking and pulleys groaning under its impossible weight, its surface still breathed warmth into the night, radiating a dull heat that made the skin prickle. Pigeons scattered from the roof in a violent cloud, wings beating as if the stone itself had ignited beneath them, and below, the ancient masonry answered with a slow, wet seep. From the points where the hoist ropes bit into the tower's edges, the stone exhaled a thin red-brown slurry, streaking downward like a fresh wound, smelling faintly of rust, tallow, and something older, sweeter, unmistakably human. The bell did not shine as bells were meant to. Its surface swallowed torchlight, dull and uneven, pocked with shallow ripples that looked less like flaws and more like impressions, as if fingers had once pressed outward from within and failed to escape. Those overseeing the raising avoided touching it longer than necessary, wiping their palms on their cloaks, unsettled by the way the metal seemed to retain warmth unevenly, hot in some places, almost cool in others, like a body whose blood had stopped circulating correctly. The air in the tower thickened as the bell rose higher, carrying a metallic bitterness that clung to the tongue and the back of the throat, a taste more intimate than smoke, more persistent than incense. Below, the city continued its routines, unaware that the bell had been cast from objects never meant to sing. Confiscated shackles rubbed smooth by ankles, execution blades dulled by bone, hooks that had once borne weight that screamed and struggled. These things had been melted together without ceremony, their histories erased in fire, or so the founders claimed, yet the bell rose heavier than calculations allowed, swaying slightly despite the still air, as if adjusting itself to its new altitude. When it finally settled into place, the tower shuddered, not sharply, but with a long, weary tremor that traveled down through stone into the surrounding streets, setting cups trembling on tables and tightening chests without explanation. For a moment, there was silence, thick and expectant, and then the warmth of the bell began to fade unevenly, releasing a faint, breath-like sound as the metal contracted. No one rang it that night, yet long after the ropes were secured and the workers descended, the tower remained awake, holding pressure inside its new heart, as if waiting for permission to remember. The bell had been poured from confiscated iron and bronze gathered quietly, without proclamation or blessing, from the city's forgotten places where memory was meant to rot. Chains were taken from damp storerooms beneath the Alcazar, their links smoothed by years of friction against bone and skin. Execution blades, their edges rounded and nicked from striking vertebrae, were stripped of their handles and stacked like firewood. Hooks once driven through shoulders and ribs were pried from walls, still darkened at the curve where flesh had clung longest. These objects were delivered at night to the foundry, unloaded without records, melted together in a single vat where distinctions dissolved and purpose was reduced to weight. The founders spoke of purity through fire, yet the molten mass resisted stirring, thickening unevenly, releasing a smell no one named aloud. It was not merely metallic. It carried a fatty sweetness, a breath of heated marrow, clinging to hair and cloth long after the furnaces cooled. Days passed before the bell was declared ready to ring, during which the tower remained closed, its narrow interior steeped in a stale heat that never fully dispersed. Dust clung to the walls in soft, dark layers, disturbed only by the occasional fall of grit loosened by the bell's settling weight. When the first bell ringer climbed the worn steps, his ascent was slow, not from age or fear, but from the way the air pressed inward, thick and sour, vibrating faintly even before his hand brushed the rope. Each step seemed to demand acknowledgement, the stone resisting slightly beneath his boots, as if the tower had learned the feel of bodies passing through and now measured them. The smell inside was sharper than below, tinged with oxidized metal and something damp, old, and intimate, coating the throat and tightening the lungs with every breath. The rope felt wrong beneath his fingers, warmer than expected, fibers stiff as if soaked, and dried repeatedly. As he climbed higher, the light narrowed, and the bell emerged from shadow not as a smooth curve, but as a looming mass, its surface dull and uneven, bearing faint distortions that suggested pressure applied from within rather than hammer blows from without. The air around it trembled subtly, a low, continuous agitation felt more in the chest than heard, setting teeth on edge and drawing breath into an unnatural rhythm. He hesitated, though there was no sound to justify it, only the sensation that something inside the bell had already noticed him. He pulled the rope. The bell did not ring cleanly. Its voice emerged thick and wet, a low vibration that slid along the stone rather than striking it, filling the tower with pressure instead of sound. Dust leapt from the walls in fine clouds, and the rope jerked hard enough to bruise his palms. The bell swayed once, then again, its motion slower than expected, as though dragging against unseen resistance. The air grew warmer with each movement, and the sour smell intensified, blooming into something unmistakably organic. Before he could release the rope, the vibration deepened, not louder but denser, compressing space itself. The bell dipped lower than its arc allowed, metal flexing with a soft, breath-like groan, and then it closed. At dawn, the tower was opened by men expecting fatigue or illness. Instead, they found the floor beneath the bell slick and dark, the stone bearing fresh fractures radiating outward like frozen ripples. The bell hung motionless, perfectly still, yet beneath it lay what remained of the ringer. His body had been folded inward, bones crushed toward the center as if gathered by an enormous hand. His ribs had pierced inward rather than outward, his spine bent into a shallow curve that mirrored the bell's interior. Skin had split along arms and shoulders where metal had kissed him, leaving edges smooth, cauterized, as though briefly pressed against something soft and hot. There was little blood, only a coppered residue smeared across the stone, warm to the touch long after the sun had risen. Word spread without announcement. The city did not speak of accident, because accidents left scatter, and this had been containment. The tower was scrubbed, prayers were read, and the body was removed in silence. Yet the smell lingered, clinging to the stairwell, embedded in the mortar. When the stone was washed, darker patches remained, refusing to lighten, absorbing water and releasing it slowly as if reluctant to let anything go. The bell was left untouched, and still it seemed awake. Those who passed beneath the tower felt pressure in their sinuses, a faint metallic taste rising unbidden, and an inexplicable need to swallow, as though their throats had tightened in sympathy. In the days that followed, the bell rang again without command. Not loudly, not enough to mark the hour, but with a low, internal hum that traveled through walls and floors, causing small objects to tremble and hearts to adjust their pace. The sound left no echo, only a sensation of compression that lingered after it ceased. Birds avoided the roof entirely. Dogs refused to pass the cathedral doors. At night, condensation formed along the interior walls of the tower, beating and running in thin lines that pooled beneath the bell, warm and faintly tinted, carrying the same rusted sweetness found at the hoist points days earlier. Those responsible insisted upon continuity. Bells were meant to ring, and silence invited speculation. Another ringer was assigned, then another after him, each climbing the tower with growing reluctance, each reporting the same oppressive air, the same subtle vibration waiting in the metal. They did not all die immediately. Some descended pale and shaking, hands trembling as if from fever, unable to explain the sensation of being measured, weighed, and briefly held. Others were not found until morning, arranged beneath the bell in variations of the same impossible compression, as though the metal experimented with shape and pressure, learning how bodies yielded. The city began to whisper that the bell remembered its ingredients, that fire had not erased their purpose but concentrated it. Shackles had learned to close. Blades had learned to finish their work without edges. Hooks had learned to pull inward rather than hold outward. The bell did not hunger in any simple way. It responded to motion, to proximity, to the offering of hands and weight. Each time it closed, it grew quieter afterward, more settled, as though sated not by flesh alone, but by the final release that accompanied it. By the time the cathedral doors were barred and the tower sealed, the bell no longer needed to ring to announce itself. The stone around it had learned the pressure, and the city had begun, unknowingly, to breathe in time with something that had already decided how memory should end. Panic spread not as sound, but as texture, a change in the way the city pressed against itself. Streets near the cathedral narrowed without moving, stones seeming closer together beneath the soles of shoes, each step heavier than the last. Breath shortened inexplicably, as though the air had thickened with invisible fibers that resisted the lungs. Merchants lingered less, prayers ended early, and even the bells of other churches rang more cautiously, their tones thinner, as if afraid of drawing attention. The tower stood unchanged, yet its presence reached outward, subtle and persistent, a pressure that made shoulders hunch and jaws tighten without conscious thought. Another bell ringer vanished, then another, their absences noticed first by the quiet left behind rather than by alarm. They were found the same way as before, beneath the bell's shadow, bodies gathered inward as if pulled by an invisible center. Limbs bent at angles no fall could explain, joints compressed beyond their natural limits, faces slack but unbroken, mouths parted in shapes that suggested neither scream nor prayer. The bronze above them bore new distortions, shallow inward curves that caught light differently, faint impressions like the memory of touch pressed from the inside. The stone beneath darkened further, absorbing what it was given, releasing warmth long after the bodies were removed. The bell began to ring on its own. It did not announce hours or feasts. It chose moments when the city was most vulnerable, deep night, the thin hours before dawn, the lull after rain. Its sound was low and wet, less a note than a saturation, sliding through walls and into flesh. Windows rattled softly without breaking. Cups trembled on shelves. People woke with clenched jaws and aching temples, the taste of metal coating their tongues as if they had bitten down on old coins. The ringing did not fade when it ended. It lingered inside the skull, a dull pressure that refused to disperse, stretching the night until sleep became shallow and unreliable. Animals sensed it first. Horses balked near the square, hooves skidding as though the ground had softened beneath them. Cats abandoned their usual hiding places, fleeing rooftops and gutters for no apparent reason. Even insects thinned, the air quieter in summer evenings, as if the smallest bodies understood something the larger ones denied. Rain behaved strangely near the tower, falling heavier there, lingering in shallow pools that never fully evaporated, carrying a faint reddish tint that stained hems and soles. The water felt warmer than it should, clinging to skin with an intimacy that unsettled those who noticed. Inside the tower, changes accumulated. Dust no longer settled evenly but gathered in arcs and spirals beneath the bell, patterns that suggested motion rather than neglect. The walls wept more frequently, condensation beating and running in deliberate paths that traced invisible lines before pooling below. The air vibrated continuously now, not loudly enough to be called sound, but strong enough to be felt in teeth and joints, a low insistence that synchronized heartbeats without permission. Those sent to inspect the interior emerged altered, moving more slowly, eyes unfocused, hands trembling as if they had pressed too long against something that pushed back. The bell's shadow deepened. It fell heavier across the floor, darker than the absence of light alone could explain, its edges soft and mutable. Bodies found beneath it appeared not merely crushed but incorporated, their final positions eerily consistent, as though the bell rehearsed the act, refining it with each repetition. Skin split cleanly where bronze had touched, edges sealed smooth, blood reduced to a thin residue absorbed by stone and metal alike. The tower smelled increasingly of rust and old fat, a scent that clung to clothing and hair, following those who had entered even briefly, marking them with an odor no washing fully removed. The city attempted distance. Routes shifted, prayers redirected, markets relocated by a few cautious steps. Yet the pressure followed, subtle but pervasive, settling into homes and workshops alike. People complained of headaches and fatigue, of dreams filled with weight and narrowing spaces. Some woke with bruises they could not explain, faint marks along shoulders and ribs as if pressed by unseen hands. Others felt compelled to touch metal, lingering too long over door latches and tools, drawn by a sensation of familiarity that repelled them even as it pulled. Records multiplied without clarity. Church authorities listed accidents and missteps, insisting on coincidence, yet the pattern refused to blur. The bell did not take indiscriminately. It responded to proximity and motion, to those whose work placed them beneath it, whose hands engaged with rope and mechanism, whose bodies offered themselves to its learned purpose. Each disappearance tightened the city's collective posture, shoulders raised, necks stiff, breath shallow. Panic became tactile, a constant friction between bodies and space, an awareness that the city itself had become slightly too small. At irregular hours, the bell rang again, sometimes twice in a night, sometimes after days of silence that allowed hope to creep back in. Its tone grew denser, more contained, as if it no longer needed volume to assert itself. The ringing left behind a residue in the mind, a persistent echo that interfered with thought, stretching moments and compressing memory. Sleep fractured into brief, uneasy intervals. Dreams repeated sensations of pressure and enclosure, of warmth where there should have been cold, of metal yielding just enough to accept what was pressed into it. The tower became a point of quiet avoidance, yet it dominated the city's internal map. Even those who never approached it adjusted their movements unconsciously, paths bending wider, pauses lengthening. The bell did not need witnesses anymore. Its presence was enough. The bronze had learned how bodies yielded, how fear traveled faster than sound, how memory could be stored not only in flesh but in stone, air, and habit. Panic no longer needed to announce itself. It lived in the weight of footsteps, in the reluctance of breath, in the metallic taste that returned each morning before the sun fully rose, reminding the city that something above them had begun to listen, and it was no longer waiting to be wrong. Church officials responded with ritual, because ritual was the only language they possessed that pretended to command the unseen. Inspections were ordered, then repeated, then widened in scope. Blessings layered over blessings until the tower reeked of oil and ash. Fasting was imposed on those who would enter, as if hunger might make the body lighter, less noticeable, less desirable to whatever waited inside the bronze. Incense was burned so thick it stung the eyes and scraped the throat raw, a choking cloud meant to purify, but instead settling into every crack and seam, mixing with older odors that refused to be displaced. The tower did not react as expected. It did not recoil. It absorbed. Inside, soot began to drift from nowhere. It did not fall like ordinary residue shaken loose by movement. It appeared slowly, delicately, as if exhaled by the stone itself, coating the walls in a greasy, matte film that dulled color and softened edges. When wiped away, it returned within hours, darker, more evenly spread, filling mortar lines and settling into corners with deliberate patience. Hands drawn across the walls came away blackened and slick, carrying a faint warmth that lingered in the skin long after contact ended. The smell beneath the incense grew stronger, a layered stench of rust, burned fat, and something old and damp that belonged more to cellars than to sanctuaries. The bell's surface changed subtly under scrutiny. Where once it had been merely uneven, now it bore faint impressions, shallow depressions arranged without pattern yet disturbingly familiar. They resembled fingerprints pressed from the inside, stretched and distorted, as if made by hands too large or too close to the surface. In some light, they vanished entirely, only to reappear when the angle shifted, catching torchlight along their edges. Attempts to polish them away failed. The bronze resisted abrasives, warming beneath effort, softening just enough to erase progress while retaining the marks, as though the metal itself preferred them there. Rain revealed more. When storms passed over the city and water struck the bell through fractured openings in the tower, it did not run cold. Droplets slid down the bronze warm to the touch, streaked with a darker hue that deepened as they descended. The water pooled on the floor below in irregular shapes that unsettled those who noticed them too closely. The outlines resembled kneeling bodies, heads bowed, shoulders hunched, hands pressed forward, as if the tower rehearsed submission in liquid form. These pools evaporated slowly, leaving stains that resisted scrubbing, faint silhouettes that persisted beneath new layers of soot and incense. Officials insisted on staying longer each time, convinced endurance would prove dominion. They recited prayers until voices cracked, paced the narrow stairs until legs trembled, pressed holy objects against walls slick with condensation. The tower responded with pressure. Breathing grew laborious, chests tightening as if wrapped. Heartbeats slowed or raced unpredictably, refusing the steady cadence of prayer. Some inspectors reported dizziness, a sensation of being gently tilted inward, as though the space itself inclined toward the bell. Others felt compelled to touch the bronze, palms flattening against its warmth despite conscious resistance, fingers spreading instinctively over the faint impressions as if seeking alignment. Incense smoke behaved strangely. Instead of rising and dispersing, it thickened, hugging surfaces, sinking into depressions, tracing the contours of walls and bell alike. In places it formed lingering veils that refused to lift, obscuring vision and dulling sound. Within these pockets, the vibration intensified, a low internal hum felt more than heard, setting teeth on edge and drawing breath into a synchronized rhythm not chosen. Candles guttered without wind, flames bending toward the bell, wax running faster than heat alone could explain, pooling at bases in soft, organic shapes. The inspections yielded no answers that could be written. Records filled with vague language, references to anomalies, to unexplained warmth, to structural irregularities that did not align with known principles. Privately, fear deepened. Some officials began to dream of compression and release, of standing beneath an immense weight that lowered without haste, of warmth closing around them in the dark. They woke with stiff joints and aching ribs, faint pressure marks on skin where none should be. Others found soot beneath their fingernails despite never touching the walls, a fine black residue that smelled faintly of iron and refused to wash away completely. Fasting weakened bodies further, and the tower seemed to notice. Those who entered on empty stomachs reported stronger sensations, more pronounced pressure, deeper vibration. Hunger sharpened awareness in ways prayer could not blunt. Knees buckled unexpectedly. Palms sweated despite the cool stone. The bell loomed heavier, its shadow deepening, its presence compressing space around it. The tower's stairs groaned under unseen adjustments, steps feeling subtly higher or lower than before, forcing changes in gait that exhausted muscles quickly. Attempts were made to seal the bell away, to shroud it in cloth soaked with holy water. The fabric darkened rapidly, warming, clinging to the bronze as if drawn by static or suction. When removed, it bore stretched impressions that mirrored the faint marks beneath, threads thinned and distorted as though pressed from the inside. The water used to soak it carried away a faint tint, leaving behind the same kneeling stains on the floor. Each intervention added layers. None erased what lay beneath. Outside, the city watched and waited, reassured by activity yet unsettled by its persistence. The tower remained occupied far longer than planned, lights burning through nights thick with incense smoke. Yet the bell continued its irregular ringing, sometimes during prayers, sometimes in their absence, its low, wet tones sliding through walls and into the gathered bodies below. No exorcism silenced it. No blessing altered its behavior. The tower accepted every gesture, every word, every offering, and incorporated them quietly, as it had incorporated metal and flesh. By the end of the inspections, exhaustion replaced confidence. Officials emerged altered, shoulders hunched, movements slowed, eyes avoiding the tower's height. Their vestments carried the smell with them into the streets, spreading rust and old fat into spaces previously untouched. The city sensed the failure before it was admitted. Ritual had not asserted control. It had merely fed the structure another layer of attention, another rhythm, another repetition. Inside the tower, soot continued to fall, water continued to run warm, and the bell rested in patient silence, its surface bearing the soft, persistent memory of hands that had never truly left. The final attempt to silence the bell was staged as reassurance, not necessity. Word was spread deliberately, encouraging attendance, filling the square with bodies whose presence was meant to dilute fear through shared witness. Clergy gathered in heavy vestments darkened by incense and sweat, their movements slow and ceremonial, voices measured to project control. The tower doors were opened wide, exposing the stairwell and its clinging odors to the open air, as if sunlight and crowds could shame the structure into obedience. The bell waited above, unseen but deeply felt, its pressure radiating downward through stone and bone alike. The exorcism began with sound, as all such efforts did. Chants layered upon one another, rising and falling in practiced cadence, their echoes swallowed by the tower's interior. Holy water was cast upward in wide arcs, droplets scattering and vanishing before they reached the bronze, absorbed by warmth and distance. Incense burned thicker than ever, smoke pouring from censers until the air grew milky and oppressive, blurring edges and softening faces. Those closest to the tower felt it first, a tightening beneath the ribs, a subtle resistance against breath, as though the space itself had grown fractionally smaller. Above, men climbed to the bell with knives and saws, hands trembling not from height, but from proximity. The ropes were thick, worn smooth by decades of use, fibers darkened and stiffened by repeated contact with warmth and residue. Cutting them was meant to be final, a decisive gesture to sever sound from source. As blades bit into the cords, the vibration intensified, not louder but denser, traveling down the ropes into arms and shoulders, setting muscles quivering. The bell did not sway in protest. It remained perfectly still, as if anticipating release. When the final strands parted, the bell fell. It did not crash. It did not shatter. It descended with controlled inevitability, metal flexing imperceptibly as it met the stone below. The impact produced a sound unlike any heard before in the tower, a deep, hollow exhalation, like breath leaving lungs too slowly. Stone fractured outward in shallow ripples, dust and fragments lifting briefly before settling again. 3 men beneath were flattened instantly, bodies compressed into the floor as if pressed by an enormous palm. There was no scattering, no violence of motion. It was containment made absolute. The bell sealed itself against the floor. Its rim spread just enough to meet stone perfectly, edges softening, conforming, closing gaps that should have resisted. No air escaped. No echo followed. The chants faltered and died in the square below as the sensation traveled outward, a collective tightening in chests, a reflexive gasp cut short. The smoke stilled, hanging unmoving in the air. For a long moment, nothing else happened. The bell rested. The tower held. Those who rushed inside afterward moved as though underwater, limbs heavy, joints reluctant. The men beneath the bell were unrecoverable. What remained of them had been pressed into the stone itself, their outlines faintly visible beneath a thin sheen of warmth and residue. Attempts to pry the bell loose failed. Tools skidded, slipped, bent. The metal resisted leverage, clinging to the floor with quiet determination, as if suction held it fast. When touched, it was warm, unevenly so, radiating heat in slow pulses that traveled up arms and into shoulders, leaving muscles weak and trembling. The bell never rang again. Silence, however, did not bring relief. The tower continued to pulse, its rhythm slower now, more deliberate. Those who stood near felt pressure building and releasing in their chests, a subtle compression synchronized across bodies, as if something inside the metal was still counting, still marking time without sound. The sensation persisted even when the square emptied, even when doors were sealed and guards posted. It followed proximity rather than sight. One could feel it through walls, through closed shutters, through sleep. Night fell, and the city waited for the familiar dread of unscheduled ringing. None came. Instead, sleep was disturbed by weight. Dreams pressed inward, filled with images of narrowing spaces, of warmth closing around limbs, of breath measured and released by something vast and indifferent. People woke with sore ribs and aching backs, as though they had labored through the night without moving. Some found faint impressions on their skin, shallow marks that faded by morning, leaving only stiffness behind. Inside the tower, changes accelerated. The floor around the bell darkened further, stone absorbing warmth and residue, radiating it back slowly. Condensation gathered along the walls, beating and running in steady patterns that traced the tower's internal geometry. Soot fell more heavily, coating surfaces in a thick, greasy layer that muffled sound and softened edges. The air vibrated continuously now, a constant low insistence felt in bones rather than ears. Officials declared the matter resolved. The bell was silent, the danger contained. Yet they avoided the tower afterward, delegating watch to others who rotated frequently, unable to endure long exposure. Guards complained of chest tightness and headaches, of difficulty focusing, of an urge to count steps or breaths without knowing why. Some abandoned their posts without explanation, leaving weapons and cloaks behind, fleeing the square as if pursued. The city adapted reluctantly. Markets resumed at a cautious distance. Routes shifted permanently, paths bending wider around the cathedral. Children were warned away without reason given. The tower became a place of avoidance, its shadow avoided even at noon. Yet the pressure remained, faint but omnipresent, a reminder that silence did not mean absence. Deep within the stone, the bell rested, sealed and still. It no longer needed to ring to assert itself. Its work had changed form. Where once it had learned through motion and sound, now it counted through pressure and patience. Each breath drawn nearby was registered. Each body that lingered contributed unknowingly to the rhythm. The bell had not been silenced. It had been closed. And within that closure, something continued to measure, to remember, and to wait. Years passed, not enough to dull memory, but enough to make fear inconvenient. The tower remained sealed, its presence folded into routine, its pressure accepted as part of the city's anatomy. New generations grew up beneath it without knowing why certain streets bent wider or why breath felt subtly heavier near the cathedral walls. Eventually, practicality overcame caution. Stone cracked. Mortar shifted. The bell, still sealed to the floor, became a problem of architecture rather than terror. Decisions were made quietly, framed as restoration, preservation, necessity. What could not be moved whole would be taken apart. The dismantling was slow and deliberate. Heat was applied carefully, meant to weaken without awakening. The bronze resisted at first, then yielded unevenly, softening in pulses that followed no external rhythm. As it was cut, the metal released no sound, yet those nearby felt pressure changes in their ears and chests, subtle pops and compressions that left them swallowing reflexively. The interior of the bell revealed no hollow. Instead, it held layers, dense and interlocked, bronze folded into itself like muscle compressed under skin. When sections were removed, the stone beneath bore impressions that mirrored human forms too precisely to dismiss, shallow reliefs that suggested kneeling, bowing, containment. The metal was carted away in guarded wagons, broken into manageable pieces, each wrapped and separated to prevent what officials called sympathetic resonance. Foundries received portions under instruction to recast them into smaller instruments, chapel bells, handbells, signaling chimes. The intention was dilution. What had been singular and overwhelming would be fragmented, rendered harmless through dispersion. Fire was trusted again to erase purpose, to reduce memory to raw material. The furnaces burned hot, yet the bronze melted reluctantly, thickening and thinning unpredictably, releasing a smell that clung to the workers long after their shifts ended. It was the same scent the tower had exhaled years before: rust, old fat, warmth without comfort. When the new bells were finished, they were unremarkable in appearance. Smooth, polished, proportioned correctly, they bore inscriptions of dedication and renewal. They were blessed individually and sent outward, scattered across parishes and villages like seeds. Each produced a tone that was strangely intimate, closer than expected, as if it originated not in air, but just behind the sternum. The sound did not carry far, yet it lingered, settling into bodies rather than traveling through space. Those who rang them felt it first, a gentle pressure in the palms, a warmth traveling up the arms, a fleeting sensation of alignment, as though hands and metal recognized each other. Accidents followed quietly. A ringer slipped from a ladder and was found folded at its base, bones drawn inward. A child pulling a chapel rope too eagerly was crushed when the beam above gave way, body compressed beneath falling weight in a manner disturbingly precise. A smith testing a handbell too forcefully felt sudden tightness in his chest and collapsed, ribs fractured inward without external blow. Each incident was isolated, explicable, filed away. Yet the pattern persisted. Harm clustered around hands, around motion, around the act of striking, pulling, ringing. The bells themselves behaved oddly. Rain striking them ran warm. Sound dampened suddenly in enclosed spaces, as if absorbed. Shadows beneath them deepened. Some rang without being touched, not loudly, not to mark time, but with a low, internal hum that caused nearby bodies to adjust posture unconsciously, shoulders rounding, breath shortening. Animals avoided them. Sleep near them fractured. Dreams filled with compression and release, with warmth closing gently, inexorably. The city noticed too late, because the city was no longer singular. The bell had been taught how to travel. What had once required mass and height now required only proximity. Memory, fragmented, had become mobile. Each smaller bell carried a portion of the original pressure, a fraction of the learned behavior. Where the great bell had taken bodies whole, these took moments, sensations, accidents that seemed misaligned with cause. The violence was quieter, easier to rationalize. There was no tower to point to, no single presence to avoid. The harm moved with the sound, intimate and selective. Scholars who examined the phenomenon years later struggled to articulate it without superstition. They noted correlations between ringing frequency and injury rates, between prolonged exposure and muscular fatigue, between sound and spatial distortion. They described the tone as wet, as dense, as resistant to air. They avoided naming the sensation beneath it, the subtle compression that accompanied each strike, the way bodies seemed to respond before minds did. Records mention an unusual number of chest injuries, of bones failing inward rather than outward, of falls that did not scatter but gathered. Only fragments of the original story survived, half-remembered warnings passed down as folklore. Some said the bell had been cursed. Others claimed it was punishment. Few understood the simpler truth. The bell had not eaten people out of hunger. It had done so out of memory. Shackles had remembered closing. Blades had remembered finishing. Hooks had remembered holding weight until release. Melted together, they had learned a new expression of their purpose. Fire had not erased that. It had taught it to unify. By breaking the bell apart, the city had mistaken silence for safety. They had taken something that required containment and taught it distribution. Each smaller bell carried a lesson refined through pressure and repetition. They did not need to kill to fulfill it. They needed only to remind bodies how easily space could be reduced, how willingly flesh yielded when guided. In time, the origin was forgotten entirely. The bells became fixtures, familiar sounds woven into daily life. People adjusted without knowing why, breath shortening slightly when a bell rang, posture tightening reflexively. Accidents continued at a steady, acceptable rate. No single event demanded attention. Memory had done its work. Somewhere, far from Seville, a small chapel bell rang at dusk, its tone warm and close. A hand released the rope a fraction too late. Breath caught. Space narrowed. The sound faded quickly, but the pressure lingered, counting softly, patiently, traveling onward, carrying with it the lesson the city had learned too late and taught to the world.